Hi, and in this video I'd like to explain a little bit about our trinket choices for Retribution Paladins in the Tomb of Sargeras. I'm going to start off by just explaining which ones are best in which situations, how we can get the best out of them on different encounters, and also some of the other trinkets on offer that might be useful as well. I'm going to preface this by explaining that of course, you may have a selection of trinkets with very different item levels, and that might change the general order. So I'm just going to assume at the moment that you've got a selection of trinkets at roughly equivalent item level, and you can always sim yourself on raid bots, for example, to see which would be best in your particular situation. Now, for absolutely every encounter in Tomb of Sargeras where you want to be progressing, then the two BIS trinkets are generally Infernal Cinders and Vial of Ceaseless Toxins. Infernal Cinders can be considered our BIS trinket from Tomb of Sargeras. It does its stuff without us having to do anything special at all. There's nothing we have to do with it. Also, don't be fooled by the fact that it can get better if there's other people have the same trinket and within 10 yards of you. You may see some other classes asking people in the raid how many have got it, because that weighs on their thinking about whether to use it or not, particularly warriors. This is not true for Retribution Paladins. This is a really good trinket for us, in fact potentially BIS trinket for us, regardless if anyone has it in the raid or not. Other people in the raid having it is simply gravy for us. So if you have this trinket on anything like a decent item level, you want to be equipping it at all times for all bosses. The second one, Vial of Ceaseless Toxins, does have an on-use ability. The stat on it is strength, which is brilliant, our primary stat, so that's always going to be good. Now, in order to apply the dot, you'll notice the trinket has a 1 minute cooldown. This means that it can line up with our Crusade pretty well. Crusade has 2 minute cooldowns, so it can be the first use you can use with Crusade, second use not, third use with Crusade, fourth use not, and so on. But you don't want to use the trinket as soon as you start. You want to build to max stacks. So what that means is that realistically you are going to have some way, if I activate Crusade, of tracking your Crusade stacks. You want to wait until you've got your 15 stacks of Crusade, then you apply the dot. Because that way it benefits from not only the extra damage, but because it's a dot, it's also going to benefit from the extra haste you have while you have those stacks of Crusade going. Obviously, the second time you use it, you won't have Crusade available, so you just use it as soon as it comes off cooldown. But then the third time you use it, again, you want it to have max stacks of Crusade. Now, if you are using it exactly on cooldown and you're using Crusade exactly on cooldown, then it should just be a simple case of using the trinket on cooldown throughout the fight. But occasionally you might delay either the trinket or Crusade for whatever reason, so just be mindful. You should be tracking not only the cooldown of the trinket, but the cooldown of Crusade and also the stacks of Crusade, as I say. Now, of course, it may be that you don't have these trinkets or you don't have them at a good item level, so what are some other potential options? Well, Specter of Betrayal is a pretty good option. Now, with Specter of Betrayal, you place an elemental when you first use it, like so. And it will pulse damage for 3 seconds. And then it will do nothing at all. It will just sit there like a lemon. But the trinket has a 45-second cooldown. And at the end of that cooldown, we'll be able to use it again. And we notice now that we have 2 of those elementals, and they both start pulsing damage because these elementals don't disappear until after a minute. So it's 45 seconds before you can use the trinket again and a minute before it disappears. Now, in order to maximize damage on this trinket, you need to make sure you're activating it while the previous one is still up. That gives you close to a 15-second window in order to use it. Like with any trinket like this, you will benefit from being able to coincide with your stacks. But what is most important is that you activate it while the previous one is still up. This trinket is actually really good in theory. The downside to it, if I just activate it again, is that the elementals don't move with you and they don't move with the target. So if the boss is in the habit of being moved around quite a lot, then this trinket becomes less useful because it's very likely that when you do activate the trinket again, the original elemental will not be near a target that it can do damage against because the boss has moved. That means that in most realistic situations it's not ideal. Some fights where it may be could be Sisters. If the boss on Sisters is always dragged back to a central point, then it could be useful on that. It can be potentially useful on Goroth, although realistically, even several weeks into the tier, on Mythic, at least in my guild, we do tend to drag the boss around quite a bit. It could be useful on Kil'jaeden if, again, he's always dragged to a particular point, but if he's not, then again, this does not become all that useful. So realistically, it's a very difficult trinket to reliably use. The fourth trinket that is actually potentially useful is Umbral Moonglaze. These are particularly good in AoE situations. If you don't have a good selection of trinkets, it can even be useful in single target. Now the way this works is it spins around, it stays in one place doing damage to all targets in the area for 8 seconds. At the end of the 8 seconds, it does a burst of damage to everything as well. To get the best out of this trinket, you need there to be multiple targets that are going to be within that area of effect for the full 8 seconds, plus the extra burst at the end of it as well. Now, thinking about those targets, you don't necessarily have to use this at full stacks of Crusade. Obviously, it's always preferable, anything that does damage, to use at full stacks. But bearing in mind, if you've even got as few as 2 targets, that does more damage than a single target with full stacks of Crusade. So the priority with this trinket is using it when you've got adds up and around in a small area. So fights where this may be useful could be Harjatan when the Murlocs come in, as long as they're not dying too quickly. If they're dying very quickly, you're probably not going to get that much use out of it. The Abyss Stalkers on Mistress Cecine, but remember on Mythic mode, you can't be killing those too quickly, so it's actually a very bad trinket to use for Mythic. But on Heroic, as long as the adds are staying up for a reasonable amount of time and they're not being burst down too quickly, it could be useful there. It's potentially useful on Desolate Host, depending on which side you're on, but if you can coincide to have it on the adds, if you're going to be on the outside where the Bone Cage armor isn't up, again, particularly important for that final explosion at the end, or in the inside if you don't have to be killing the Priestess too quickly, or if the Priestess that you don't kill is dragged out, then you're fine using it at that point as well. Remember, the priority is using it when there are multiple targets up over having full stacks of Crusade. Having both at the same time, of course, is absolutely brilliant. Now, the 2 remaining trinkets, Cradle of Anguish and Engine of Eradication, are not ideal. Cradle of Anguish, the problem with this one is if you drop below 50% health, you are going to lose all your stacks. This happens quite a lot on Mythic bosses especially, even when they're on relatively straightforward farm. So until you've got bosses on easy farm, where your health can be guaranteed to stay high, you should not be using Cradle of Anguish. It can be quite a useful one for soloing content because the stats are very good, but you lose out whenever you lose the stacks, and if you're going to lose them multiple times a fight, then it becomes problematic. Engine of Eradication, which I don't have on my Paladin, I have on my Rogue, which can be seen here, is not ideal for 2 reasons. First of all, it has Mastery on it as its main stat. Mastery at the moment is fairly poisonous for us. Even when 7.3 comes out, and this video will still be relevant for 7.3, and Mastery is still not so bad, it's still not necessarily going to be our greatest stat. Of course, you have to sim your own stat weights to determine that for yourself. But the main downside to this is the effect. It spawns 4 orbs, which to get the benefit from, you have to collect up. You have to basically play a game of Pac-Man. This will inevitably lead you to moving out of melee range, even if only for a couple of seconds. Now, for a class like a rogue building up energy, they can spend all their energy, then move out, collect the orbs while energy is building up again before moving back onto the boss. It's much less harmful for them. With Retribution Paladin, we don't have any such situation. We need to be using abilities every time global cooldown is finished. We need to be spamming them. So moving out for even a couple of seconds is much more damaging to our DPS than it is for other classes, for example. As such, unless you have a very high item level Engine of Eradication compared to your other trinkets, I would generally steer clear of this one. In addition to everything else, it's not always on all bosses easy to see when the orbs spawn anyway. For example, they can disappear under Goroth and you're not necessarily sure that they're even there. Now, one point that I should mention is you might be in a situation, as I was towards the start of Tomb of Sargeras, where, for example, let's say your best two trinkets are Specter of Betrayal and Vial of Ceaseless Toxins. Now, these are both unused trinkets. Generally speaking, we advise against using two unused trinkets because you cannot use them both at the same time. So watch what happens when I use one of them. So let's say I decide to use Specter of Betrayal. You can see that it's putting the Vial of Ceaseless Toxins on a short cooldown of its own. So it's not a simple case of building to 15 stacks and then trying to use both trinkets at once. That is unlikely to be successful. In this particular case, the priority is on using Vial of Ceaseless Toxins on full stacks. So the procedure in this case would be to use Specter of Betrayal first, then build up to 15 stacks, and then once you've done that, as soon as your Vial becomes available, then you can use that. The same would equally apply if you had the Moonglaze plus the Vial as well. The Vial has priority on the full stacks. Moonglaze, apart from anything else, remember the priority is having multiple adds up at the same time. And then after that, you should be fairly safe using them on cooldown because Specter of Betrayal has a very different cooldown to Vial of Ceaseless Toxins. Remembering you want to use that Specter of Betrayal as soon as you can when you're back on the boss and you're back in the same place. We need to be having, for it to do the damage that the Sims will say it does, you need to be having two of them after the first time. From the second time you activate it onwards, you need to be having two pulsing their damage on the boss or other adds. Now, of course, there are trinkets from other places, and with the Titan Forge and Mythic Plus system that exists in Legion, it is perfectly possible to get trinkets not only from previous raids that can rival the item level of the ones we're getting from Tomb of Sargeras, but also from dungeons. Now, I'm not going to go through a great long list of all of these trinkets, but my particular picks, if you don't have any of the ideal ones from Tomb of Sargeras, could include Horn of Valor. If you've got a decent item level Horn of Valor, this, remember, could be macroed in with your Crusade. You would certainly use this at the same time as your Crusade. Not really going to be a great one to use with another unused trinket though. Memento of Boda is particularly good, especially if your raid is in the habit of having people die. Then this can end up proccing quite a lot for you. And of course you get the extra benefit with the Retribution passive as well. So this is a great little trinket to use in those situations. Convergence of Fates, remember the way that this works, it can be absolutely brilliant for you, or it can be not so good. We even had someone asking on Discord yesterday, oh, this is simming really well for me, is it good? It all depends on the fight length. You can sim it for yourself and it turns out that this trinket's really good for you. Change the sim fight length a little bit and all of a sudden it's a different story. Convergence of Fates is great in one of two situations. Either when the fight length is such that you'll get an extra use of Crusade out, or if it allows you to use Crusade at a more convenient time. Now, it's really difficult to predict these in each case. So let's say you have a fight that takes about 6 minutes, for example. Now, without Convergence of Fates, you'd be using your first Crusade on 0. You'd be using your second Crusade on 2 minutes. Your third on 4 minutes. And then you can't get a fourth out because that's available at 6 minutes while the boss has just died. Now, with Convergence of Fates, that usually knocks off about 10 seconds each time. So you could use it on naught again as normal. Your second one would be on 1:50. Your third one would be on about 3:40. And then you could get a fourth one on about 5:30, which gives you about half a minute, which is round about the time of Crusade, depending on how many relics you've got. And you've got a fourth use out of it. So then you've benefited. But let's say 1 week you do kill it in 6 minutes. You think, oh, I'm going to use Convergence because it takes us 6 minutes to kill this boss. But then let's say the following week you do even better and you kill it in about 5:30. Well, you haven't really benefited because you've still only got 3 Crusades out. Or let's say something goes wrong, it takes you a bit longer, it takes 6.5 minutes. Well, you could still have got 4 out even without Convergence. So this is the problem with Convergence, just predicting how long the fight's going to last, how frequently you can use Crusade, can you get an extra benefit out? If you can, it's absolutely fantastic. If you can't, All it is the extra strength for you. Now, as I say, this is mostly focusing on Tomb of Sargeras trinkets, so I'm not going to go through all the other trinkets they can be. I always get a few questions about those. The answer, as always, is to sim it, and Raid Bots 2.0 is a pretty good way to do that now. What I would suggest, though, is that the Tomb of Sargeras trinkets, unlike previous raids in Legion, have actually presented us with a good selection. 4 out of the 6 are pretty good for even progress fights. 2 of them are excellent. So we shouldn't really have to look too far afield for our choice of trinkets for Tomb of Sargeras progress. So I hope you found this video useful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.